In your book, you say the practice of viewing female physiology as toxic throughout the ages has left a damaging legacy of inadequate research, dismissal by a patriarchal medical system, an uncaring society, and insufficient education about how the female body works. What are the societal and individual consequences of that?
Well, I think first of all, it's people not knowing how their body works, not having any education. I wouldn't say any, obviously people have some, but when we can't have non-sophomoric discussions about physiology in schools, when we have to separate boys and girls, when we talk about these things in ways that they're dirty or use pejorative terms, then people start to think their body is dirty. Where do you go to ask questions about something that's dirty or shameful, right? Maybe you shouldn't even ask a question. So it leads people, I think one of the big consequences, it leads people to just turn inwards, right? So they, they're shame, they have shame, or they don't know where to turn. Or if they have questions, they don't have a legitimate person to turn to. So, there's this thing called data voids, right? So if I make up a term, if I make up something, I say, oh, you need to do dumbbell kettlebell swings, which are like, I just made that up, right? So if you Google that, you wouldn't find anything. But if I wrote a post about that and made up a whole bunch of stuff and just picked words that sounded like from exercise physiology and from workouts and things like that, that would be the only Google hit you'd get. And then you'd read that and you think, oh, that must be true. So when we have data voids, that also leads people away from good sources of information and to sources that could be, incorrect.
So is there inadequate research when it comes to female physiology, topics like your book on menstruation, and these big glaring sort of gaps in the research? Or is it that there is a lot of information, it's just not finding its way to the public?
Well, I think it's both. So definitely there's massive gaps. And if we go back a little bit in time, obviously in the 1950s and 1960s, research wasn't, done the same way it's done now. And it was just kind of the idea about, testing products and what needs to be regulated. And there'd been several attempts by the FDA about, how you're going to, or what was initially the FDA. I don't remember all the names of the agencies. And then we had thalidomide, right? And so the idea that giving a medication in pregnancy could have absolutely catastrophic consequences all of a sudden became on everybody's mind. And I think this became a very convenient excuse to exclude women from lots of studies. Oh, we can't test our blood pressure medication because you might get pregnant. Oh, we can't test this because you might be pregnant. And we don't know what the effect it could be.
So is that a fear?
Yeah, well, it was out of fear, but also...
Can you bring us up to speed with that story if someone's not familiar with it?
Oh, with thalidomide, yeah. So thalidomide was... I don't know much about the drug, obviously, because I've never prescribed it, but it was a medication that was given actually for morning sickness during pregnancy. My mother was actually given it. She was back in England. My parents are from England, and she was pregnant with my brother and didn't take it. So she used to, whenever there was a thalidomide story, she would literally have this like stress reaction, which you can kind of understand. And it caused terrible, I believe they're called limb reduction defects. So children were born with no arms and no legs, and often with sort of small appendages at their joints, and just devastating consequences, devastating. And it turns out that if you give thalidomide at a very specific juncture during embryology, you affect the limb buds. If you give it later in the pregnancy, maybe there wouldn't be that effect. But if you give it at that exact wrong time, which is also the time when people have morning sickness, it's a terrible, terrible recipe. And so this wasn't studied adequately. I don't even know how much it was studied at all. And we had this terrible, catastrophe. So that, I think, became an excuse to exclude women from studies, right? So two things can be true. You have to worry about giving people untested medications in pregnancy. But it can also be true that testing women who have a menstrual cycle where hormones change every single day is more complex than studying men who don't have that. So if you're a pharmaceutical company and you're like, hey, I can conveniently exclude the people who are more expensive or more challenging to study, you're going to want to do that. And so there was this, I think, as sort of a change in how we were studying things was happening, the idea that women should be studied as well just was like, well, we can't. And it became a convenient excuse. And then it just continued. And, we saw, very little investment in studying medications for diabetes or high blood pressure, things like that. When you look at, the massive populations of people that were studied initially for statins, so mostly men. And it took, legislation in the United States in 1993 to say, well, if you're going to use federal funds to study something and that drug is applicable for both women and men, you have to have, you have to study both. And so it took, the federal government stepping in because, again, capitalism wants to take the easiest, cheaper route. So there's that. But then in addition, you have the fact that, pain has been underappreciated for women. It's so fascinating. You can either say that, there's awful tropes about women being able to bear more pain because they can have pregnancy, but also women are whiners and complainers, right? So it's sort of, wait a minute, how can you, how does that work? So, the female physiology is, I would say, discussed not appropriately as you see fit, right? You can twist it for whatever you want. So we have these conditions that we started to develop technology to understand. So for example, endometriosis, which is where tissue similar to the lining of the uterus grows outside in the pelvic cavity and may well be a system-wide inflammatory condition. I don't think we really know yet. Or polycystic ovarian syndrome. Both of these affect on average 10%. And depending on the studies, it could be a little bit more, but we'll just say, to make it easy, 10%. So you now have, in the 1970s, you didn't have ultrasounds. You didn't have things that you could use to sort of properly identify these things. But as these tools became developed, the idea that these things merited study just didn't seem to click. So our very first understanding of polycystic ovarian syndrome was basically, well, it's because you're overweight. And, now we know that while being overweight can magnify the symptoms, the incidence is the same. It's not a condition of obesity. It's a medical condition that exists and can be made worse by obesity. And so
you can be a healthy, quote unquote, body weight.
Yeah, you can
normal
have
BMI and
you could have a normal
PCOS.
BMI and have PCOS, absolutely. But then you see, okay, well, people with obesity are going to be overrepresented in studies if they tend to have worse symptoms, right? Mm-hmm. But then that also led to people who weren't obese being dismissed, being told you can't possibly have PCOS. So you can see how it can lead to bad care in so many different ways. It can lead to blaming people for their medical condition inappropriately. You should never do that. But biologically, it doesn't even work here. And also lead people to not get a diagnosis. And so, when we first started really, I think, spending money on health for women, it was sort of in the context of maternal and child health. So a lot of money on obstetrics, a lot of money on improving pregnancy outcomes, a lot of money on contraception, all which are important. And I'm not saying that those aren't. But it seemed that the idea of how to improve the lives of women outside of pregnancy or outside of getting pregnant seemed to not really be thought of until relatively recently.
Are women or females, people with a female reproductive system, we can talk about language at some point in this conversation, are they particularly vulnerable to misinformation?
Well, I think when you look at, you have half the population who's more economically disadvantaged, right? So there's that. So you have economic disadvantage. If you're looking in, places where, if you're more likely to be a single parent, you have more financial strain, you have less time. So you have all these other factors that might contribute. You have glass ceilings. You have the fact that women are more likely to end up doing emotional labor in relationships. There's a fascinating study that looks at in a heterosexual relationship, even when men and women are doing the same number of hours per week, the men are doing more of the fun stuff, right? So you look at things like unequal division of labor and all these things, those create strain. And I think all of those factors can become additive in a way that can make it harder. Maybe it's harder for you to have time to go to the medical provider. Maybe it's harder for you to pay for your medications. Maybe you go and you You can't afford to travel for the referral, and then you add in on top, of course, in the United States, abortion restrictions, and you add in that women are even being, turned away from getting appropriate care because, people are afraid of being arrested for, doing an abortion. People who are miscarrying can't even go in and get the medication in some of these states to help them complete their miscarriage. And people are even being arrested. So I think that there's a lot of different sort of levels of inequality. So, and when there's inequality, you're more likely to be taken advantage of, you're more likely to suffer.